His subversive, sensual stories have won awards all over the world. Karim Aïnouz is a proud exponent of contemporary Brazilian cinema, a filmmaker pushing against what he sees as an increasingly conservative climate. His latest release won the Satã Prize at the Cannes Film Festival, a tropical melodrama exploring the intensity of sisterly love and the reality of being a woman in 1950s Brazil.
Eu sinto que o Yorgos me ama para sempre.
Karim Aïnouz, thanks so much for joining us. Now, your film, The Invisible Life of Eurídice Guzmán, is out here in Europe, having had great success at the Cannes Film Festival, where it won a prize. And it tells the story of two sisters, Eurídice and Guida, in Brazil in the 1950s. And those two women are, I think, suffocated, controlled by their family and by society. What is it about them that is so dangerous?
I think I would answer that question by the other way around. Why are men so dangerous to these women? You know, I think there's really nothing dangerous about them, but I think it's about men who have been so toxic about women in general. I think the film is really about that. You know, it's about, in the film itself, there is a scene, and in the book actually then becomes a film, where one of the sisters comes back, she runs away with her boyfriend. This is 1952. She comes back home without her boyfriend 6 months later and pregnant. And the father just throws her in the trash, literally. Basically, he forbids her to come home. He separates her from her sister. He rejects her completely. So the question is, why? These women were made to believe that they were dangerous, but it's actually the other way around, you know.
Não volta tarde hoje, não. Ele tá ou não tá na janela? Eu prometo que eu te devolvo, tá? Guida, esses brincos aí são da vovó. Eu sei.
Now, the film has a very sensual, intimate feel. We get very close to these two main characters, and we get very close to their bodies. We see what happens to them physically, which is sometimes beautiful and sometimes quite brutal. How did you go about writing that and filming that with your two main actresses?
It seemed to me that it was crucial that we had the body very present, because I think these are, you know, as a man, to just think of all what women go through, you know, to be able to become women. I mean, it is so beautiful, but yet so violent. There are scenes that are very explicit about, you know, a woman, you know, giving birth, for example, which, you know, that I think we tend to romanticize, but I think it's something that demands such physical energy. I think, you know, it's funny when they say that in Portuguese, or I think in French, or I don't know, in English, but when they say the female is the fragile sex, and it's like, it's not true, you know, like a person who is able to have somebody within them and to give birth, it's not a fragile character as well. It's quite the opposite.
And the question of abortion is actually raised at one point in the film. Someone considers it, and it's very taboo in that context. Even today, the question is quite controversial in Brazil. Abortion rights are pretty restricted. What does your film have to say about this big question of motherhood?
Again, speaking from the perspective of a man, but a man who has been raised within a context of a very matriarchal family. The question was before abortion, which is like, the character of Eurídice, does she really want to be a mother? Does she really want to be a mother in spite of the fact that by being a mother, she maybe has to give up her professional dreams?
Com sorte você engravida. Eu não quero engravidar agora. Eu vou prestar a escola de Viena.
Você tá pouco chateada, né? Com a sua irmã, que fugiu.
A minha irmã não fugiu. Ela foi viajar.
I think that it is only within patriarchal societies that this question is criminalized, you know, because a woman is basically, if she doesn't want to be a mother, she is not a criminal, but she's an outcast. And the woman who doesn't want to have a child, if she's pregnant and she has an abortion, is called a criminal.
And speaking of contemporary Brazil and the arts specifically, we've seen this golden age of cinema in the last couple of decades. Directors like yourself coming to festivals like Cannes and Berlin. There are always Brazilian films. But in Brazil, the cultural climate has changed. And certain shows that receive public financing, if they talk about politics, they have been cancelled. We've seen that happen. Do you worry about censorship?
I do. I worry about the discontinuing of public support for the arts. And of course, in my field for cinema, I feel we're living in a dramatic moment. And I think it's worse than censorship because censorship is something that, it's an enemy that you fight against. What's happening is the National Film Agency has really slowed down the financing of Brazilian films. So, you cannot say it's censorship, but it's technical misconduct. So, there is a very clear agenda of not supporting diversity, but actually supporting an agenda that has to do with religion, that has to do with a certain idea of what Brazil is, and which has to do with an authoritarian and very, very poor understanding of what culture is.
I wanted to ask you about those structural changes. In fact, the fact that the Ministry of Culture has now been degraded to an undersecretariat since the arrival of Bolsonaro, and is now headed up by Roberto Alvim, who's a right-wing...
No, he's not right-wing. He's a maniac. It's different. I mean, I think the world cannot say that the Brazilian government is right-wing. The Brazilian government is a fascist government. Right-wing is something different. Trump is right-wing, So, and I think that the Secretary of Culture, he is just, a psychologically, ill person. I mean, it is a tragedy and it is a reason for us to be very ashamed of what Brazil is because this man is out of his mind. I mean, what he's been doing, what he's been saying publicly would be enough to have him in jail, So I think it also puts into question something which is even more serious, which is, are we living in another democracy? Because in a real democracy, where, the legal system would be working healthily, this man would not be allowed to be free. It's something very serious that we're going through. And I think my other problem with this, too, is a lot of countries should be boycotting Brazil, but they're not. They're doing trade deals with Brazil.
And speaking of external support for Brazilian products, there is no boycott on the culture. That's certainly true. We see a lot of Brazilian arts, film, music, in festivals, in museums, in concerts here in Europe. How would you say the Brazilian people in Brazil, how do you see their relationship with the arts? How do they consume them? How much access do they have?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think that there is a real exuberance in what's happening with Brazilian culture in the last year. But I think that, at the same time, we need to be very honest and frank. There's a big part of the Brazilian population that has no access to cinema, for example, that cannot pay to go to see films, that are consuming basically televisions. Unless you are pro the elected government, everybody who is not is really appreciative of the fact that we are existing in Brazil and abroad through a vibrant, cultural production.
And one issue that those who would wish to censor the arts in Brazil that is particularly problematic is anything to do with LGBT rights or questions. And your first feature-length film, Madame Satã, talked about a bohemian man in the 1930s in Rio who was a transvestite, who was a homosexual.
Yeah.
That film was made in 2002, I believe.
That's right.
Could it be made now?
No, I mean, it could have been made, but if it was an underground film. It's not a film that would have had public support because it speaks about, he's a black character from the Northeast, who happens to be a cross-dresser, but, he is part of a majority, he's part of, the majority of Brazil is a black country. The majority of the population of Brazil is from Africa. I would not have been able to make it as a movie. Maybe I would have been able to make it as a movie without any money, without any support, really an underground film shot with my cell phones. We are told every day that those films cannot be made, but I think it's very important they continue to be made, even if without public support.
And speaking again, just briefly, of Brazilian politics, former President Lula was recently released from jail, which gave some people hope in the power of the Supreme Court, others less so. When leaving jail, he said Brazil didn't get better, it got worse, which is a pretty pessimistic view of the country. What are your thoughts on the political future?
I think my thoughts on the political present is we just need to look at the numbers. The income inequality in Brazil has raised. The amount of people that are unemployed has raised. I think that we are in a country also where there is, there's a widespread discourse around hate, which has raised a lot. So I think that Lula is very lucid. When you think that the whole project of the government of the last, I begin with Fernando Henrique, it's not only Lula, but the whole government of those, let's say, 16 years or even more, the agenda was how can we bridge income inequality in the country that has one of the biggest concentration of wealth in the world. See what's happening in Chile, see what's happening in other Latin American countries, any other country in the world. It's a neoliberal project of concentration of wealth where the income has not been, equally divided. So I think he's absolutely right.
And a recent project of yours took you to Algeria, which is the country your father was originally from, I believe. It was the first time you went there, and you were going to make a film. I believe that didn't quite turn out as planned. Can you explain what happened?
Of course. I'm half, my mother was Brazilian, my father is Algerian, he's Kabila. And I did go this year, I had never been there. And I wanted to just take that trip, and figure out where he came from and go to his village and know a little bit the country. So I went there alone with the camera to be able to do a travel diary, let's say. I get to Alger, and like a week later, there is the uprisings that starts to happen, of basically a young generation that demanding, for the regime to step down and for Algeria to be a truly democratic country. So the film did take a different turn, and it became something else, but, I think for a fantastic reason, I think it's so refreshing. I mean, think about this, it's so refreshing to be coming from a country like Brazil that was full of hope, and in the last year and a half, 2 years, has been kind of shut down, I mean, I hope that, this somehow contaminates Brazil now, and that we can actually step out publicly and collectively to resist and to imagine a better country. And it was just very inspiring. It was a gift from life.
Querida irmã, descobri o que é ser uma mulher sozinha nesse mundo. Não perco a esperança de que você volte ao Brasil e que nos encontraremos. Por favor, não se esqueça de mim.